one thing I would ask people to avoid is what I would call food fundamentalism or development fundamentalism. Look for blended solutions. It's not one or the other. It's combinations, right? Don't go down that trap of what I call false dichotomies of one model versus another model.
This is a podcast called Walk, Talk, Listen. An attempt to connect people and make this world a bit better by sharing opinions and experiences based on the belief that everyone's perspective is true, albeit partial. My name is Maurice Blom, and I would like to welcome you to yet another episode of Walk, Talk, Listen. Okay, good day, everybody. This is another episode of the podcast Walk, Talk, Listen. And as always, I'm delighted with today's guest who will introduce himself. Glenn, please go ahead.
Thank you, Maurice. My name is Glenn Denning. I am a professor of practice at SIPA, the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. My main role there is to manage and teach in a program called the MPA in Development Practice, a 2-year master's program focusing, as it describes, on development practice, sustainable development practice.
And we know each other from New York. You are not in New York at the moment. You're in Australia, right? Were you born and raised in Australia?
I was born and raised in not far from where I am right now. I'm at the Sunshine Coast, which is an hour and a half north of Brisbane, a relatively large city, now about 2 million people. So strangely, perhaps, you would think I grew up in an urban setting. I grew up in suburban Brisbane. And in terms of background, what sort of led me in this direction to work in agriculture and food security, I guess I'd have to say, importantly, my father was a farmer. He wasn't a farmer, when he was married and had us, but he was a farmer as a young man, and so we used to get stories about agriculture and farming whenever we would go on holidays, and so I got some exposure that way. But even more so, he grew orchids. He was sort of living out his post-farmer life by growing orchids and gardening. And I got a lot of exposure to that. So when they'd go away on holidays, I'd have to look after the orchids. I'd have to water them, make sure the bugs didn't eat them. And, I used to grow vegetables in the backyard, and enter them into the local church flower show and things like that, to sort of for competitions. And so I just got that sort of, exposure to growing things. And I, of course, Queensland, this area is very kind of subtropical, so you can be outdoors a lot. So all of those things kind of influenced me. So going into agriculture, I was sort of looking for something to do, for a profession. And I thought, well, here's something that enables me to be outdoors, to grow things, and actually somebody might be willing to pay for me to do it, and give me a job. So agriculture, that's how I got into agriculture.
And do you have any siblings?
Yes, I do.
And
two brothers.
Are they in the same field?
Not at all. Not at all.
Okay, so but that's an interesting, right? That you were
they're in trades, and in fact, neither of them have gone into any kind of international work at all. So no, we're just very different. Yeah.
So how do you think that came about then? That you kind of went into the kind of in the footsteps of your dad, but your other two brothers did not. Are you are the eldest or are the youngest? Or
I'm the eldest. I'm the eldest.
Okay.
It's hard to say. My father passed away in my last year of university, so he died very young, and I guess I had there was some incentive impetus to do something, useful with my life. But, to be honest, I think serendipity played a large part, just happy, positive occurrences. And the way I got into international agriculture, I overheard a conversation in the final year of my agricultural science course. I was specializing in soils. And I heard a conversation between two students, and one of them had said that he was planning to go off to Indonesia, to Bali, in fact, to do research for his master's degree, but for personal reasons, he decided he wasn't going to go ahead with it. And I just heard it during a coffee break in class. And I thought, that's interesting. So I just talked to him and he told me what it was about. So I went down and spoke with the professor, Ross Humphreys. I went and spoke with him and I said, well, I heard so-and-so won't be going. Would you consider me? I don't even know why I said that. I hadn't thought, oh, I've desperately got to go out into the world, go to wherever. But I went down there and he said, come back in a week. And I came back in a week and presumably he checked that my grades were okay. And I wasn't a troublemaker or anything like that. And he said, yeah, but you've not worked in pastures. And this was more to do with animal pastures and crops and so on. And so he said, you'll have to do a few courses, but yeah, you can do it. I think I can take you. And so that led me to, a year later, I'm in Indonesia. I'm on the island of Bali in the 1970s, growing crops and pastures under coconuts, doing things that had never even crossed my mind. And there started the journey. So, 1 year in Bali, learning about tropical agriculture, learning how difficult it is to grow stuff, all the stuff you learn in classes, and then you actually have to grow it like a farmer to grow your crops for your research. Every disaster that could have happened, whether it be weather, pests, you name it, wandering livestock, eating your crops, everything happened. So I really, at a very early age, 22 years old, I got an idea of what it's like to be a small-scale farmer in these kinds of situations. So that's how it all started. Serendipity. Yep. I came back from Bali. I wrote up my research, and of course, I only had 1 year at that point, 1 year of experience, if you'd call it that. It was research, And as I was sitting there at my cubicle working on my, writing up my thesis, somebody had a job for the Philippines, for a tropical agronomist to work in Mindanao in the southern Philippines. And it said it required 5 years of relevant experience and all of that. And I'd been kind of struggling to get a job. I'd already been looking for a job, and I applied for the New South Wales Soil Conservation Service. I'd applied for a tutoring job at an agricultural college. I needed a job. Right? I needed to eventually go somewhere. And this thing came along, and I said, "You're kidding! I don't have 5 years experience." And then we had a discussion, and we concluded that I actually had a lifetime of experience in tropical agriculture because I'd grown up in Brisbane. So I put this story together, and blow me down, I got the job. So I ended up in Mindanao for 3 years.
Wow.
And, again, serendipity. If this fellow had not passed me this newsletter, because you used to learn about jobs, not by the internet, there were things called newsletters that arrived in the post and things like that. So we looked at this thing, and I hand wrote my application, no emails. I hand wrote my application and got the job. And it was, amazing. It was, and I really did build on the Bali experience. This was a different kind of experience. This was what was called integrated rural development. In those days, there were some in the 70s and 80s, there were a lot of big projects that were trying to combine different sectors. Particularly, this one was building roads, constructing roads. And my job was to then work with farmers to see how they could use those roads, how they could generate some surpluses that traders could come and purchase so that they would be sort of lifted out of poverty that way. So at a very early stage, I learned the importance of roads, of transport, of infrastructure, and I've never forgotten that. Secondly, I kind of learned the importance kind of working with small scale farmers and understanding, really what they needed and what they valued. The importance of credit, because again, there was this perception that I would go and demonstrate these new technologies, and farmers would, through some form of magic, sort of take them up and be, like this light on my head from the sunshine, be enlightened, and they would go off and do it. But the reality is, most of these things require capital of some kind. They require money to buy seeds or fertilizers or whatever. And so I came to that conclusion: we needed a credit program. We needed to involve banks. And so again, that was like something that I'd never planned for, but then it turned out to be a very useful lesson, and the importance of institutions as well as infrastructure. So this was all a learning process. As I said, 3 years down in Mindanao, on a fairly remote area, doing rural development, sort of stayed with me for a lifetime.
Yeah, I can imagine. And in those 3 years, you were able to go back and forth, back home for vacation, or you were there straight?
I did, no, it wasn't straight. It was a funny kind of a setting that it because a lot of the work was construction, was road construction and irrigation construction. They wanted us to work 6 days a week. So we worked. That's another thing I learned. I learned that Saturdays are normal working days. And so we worked Monday to Saturday, 7:30 to 5 p.m. And then after 3 months, we would get a week off. It was a little bit like working in the oil industry, on and off, that sort of thing. But we would be allowed to go, we could go anywhere we liked for a week. And so I actually used those weeks off. People thought I was crazy because, everybody wanted to go and party and have a good time. I headed off to Taiwan and learned about vegetables for a week. I went to Thailand and visited a bunch of projects. So I was in this sort of learning, absorbing all these interesting ideas. And even when it came to annual leave, because we had, I think, 5 or 6 weeks break at the end of 1 year,
you did.
I went to Europe. I'd never been to Europe. So I thought I'd jump on a flight, and I went to Paris and Switzerland and kind of roamed around Europe for 6 weeks. So yeah, I didn't actually go home to Australia for 2 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, and then what happened after those 3 years?
Okay, can we continue with the theme of serendipity? So here I am. One of the things I was doing was I was doing some field research, doing a few experiments to sort of evaluate different varieties. And at that time, sort of early days of well, not early days, but the Green Revolution was this sort of, particularly with rice, was sweeping through much of Asia. And some people from the International Rice Research Institute came down and visited our project in Mindanao, and I met them, and they asked, would we be able to kind of carry out a few experiments for them to see how their rice varieties would perform in that part of Mindanao, and said sure, and we did it. And on one of those visits, the person in charge said to me, "Hey, so you've been here a couple of years now. Any chance you'd be interested in coming to Erie? Because I'm going on a sabbatical leave next year, and I'll be away for a year, and we need somebody to sort of step in and replace me for 12 months." And at that time, I was looking at going back to Indonesia or Thailand or I was already in that sort of, I wanted to work in this international agricultural development stuff. And I thought, yeah, sure, I'll look at that. And so I, went up to Erie, which was just outside of Manila, Los Baños, just an hour or so out of Manila. And blow me down, they offer me this job to replace this distinguished Erie scientist. I was blown away because for me, Erie was very famous. It was like the the Harvard of international agriculture. I should say the Columbia of international agricultural research. So I went there, and I was on a 1-year contract. I actually took a pay cut to go there, which I didn't care. Like, I was happy to go. And I went for 1 year and ended up staying for 18 years.
Oh.
18 years.
Oh.
Yeah. So there it goes. 18 years, married, kids, PhD. like all of this during those 18 years. Like I was there after, when I was there about a year or two, they said, you're never going to make it in international agricultural development, certainly not in international research without a doctorate. So you need to go off and get a doctorate. And I hadn't ever thought of that. I didn't think I would ever need a PhD. I said, I'm a practitioner. Master's degree is fine. Anyway, so I went off. I contacted the University of Reading in the UK, and they had a very interesting scheme, probably a remnant of their old colonial sort of connections, whereby you could actually work in your job and collect data, and at some point, after a couple of years, go to Reading, spend a year, do all the analysis, write it up as a thesis. I did that. And I came out sort of by mid-80s. I'd been there a few years and I had a PhD. And then, my director general at that time, MS Swaminathan, the very famous Indian scientist and leader, he then more or less gave me a permanent job. So it was like I could stay on, and I loved it. And my work evolved. Even though it was the International Rice Research Institute, my job was still very much the sort of the development part of it, the part where you're trying to bring technologies to farmers and you're trying to understand what are the impediments to uptake adoption. So my work evolved into working with countries. I really love this idea of working with what we call national systems. So after a few years, I sort of was working less in the Philippines and much more in the region. And so particularly one part of the region, which, if you read my book at some point, the part of the region that I really became very connected with was Cambodia, because it was sort of post-Khmer Rouge recovery. And I suspect there was some Church World Service people there at the time, because there were only really NGOs. So I started helping Cambodia work on rice and sort of restore their rice industry, rice economy, rice farming. So that's how it evolved over 18 years. That was meant to be 1 year. And somewhere, by the way, just to throw in another one, somewhere along the way, I realized that I'm sort of by default sort of finding my way into management. And I've never done a management course in my life. I've never done even not a lot of economics. And so at some point, after about 10 years there, I went off to the Harvard Kennedy School and I did an MPA, Master of Public Administration. And that kind of really was, pretty life-changing, actually. So I built that on top of my agricultural science background. So
Why was that life-changing? The MPA?
It just, it moved me out of my sort of previous comfort zone. It helped me better understand. I mean, firstly, it really strengthened my understanding of economics. And then I realized how much of what I do and how much of the way the world works is based on economics. And understanding that and understanding the language and the tools of economics for somebody who'd been mostly thinking about how to grow stuff was really enlightening. But then I did a number of courses, but one of them that stuck with me for the rest of my career and is still with me today was a course called Institutional Design. And institutional design was taught by a professor, Michael Barzilay. He's at LSE right now, but back then he taught this course, and what was really fascinating was it was about how do you make public institutions more responsive to clients or customers, or as we used to say, beneficiaries. Like, how do you, instead of an institution doing what that institution thinks is the best thing for you, it basically operates much more like what a lot of the models came from the service industry. The idea you can't have a service industry without defining the product, the service, the customer, and then designing your work around meeting their needs. So the idea that I could work with programs even the Cambodian Agricultural Research Institute and work with them to help them understand that their clients are the farmers, and we need to understand what the farmers want, what they need, what their aspirations are, in order to design an institution to meet those needs and to design programs and investments to do that. So I would say that more than anything else stuck with me for the rest of my life. You know, like I've sort of carried that with me at Erie, and then, you know, after Erie, went off to Africa for 11 years, and after that, eventually to New York. But so some of these things you get early on, you bring for the rest of your life.
Fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I would like to make a couple of quick jumps. I mean, you mentioned Africa. Where in Africa did you go?
Yeah, I was based in Nairobi. I worked initially my first 6 years there. Here's another case. I went there, you know, we'd lived in Asia all our lives, by then married, 3 children. And, you know, Africa, I'd already started going to Africa a little bit with Erie, with the Rice Research Institute. I'd traveled there a few times, but I'd never lived there. But then this opportunity came up, and I was invited to work at the international, it was called ICRAF, the International Centre for Research in Agroforestry. It was subsequently, it's one of these horrible acronyms, so we subsequently renamed it the World Agroforestry Centre. So from rice to agroforestry, from crops to trees, from farms to landscapes, it was a kind of a very fascinating, you know, like, and to some extent challenging, but certainly exciting transition. So Nairobi, but I was in charge of all of the Africa programs. So I was working in Southern Africa, East Africa, West Africa, and even South Asia. I still had a foot in South Asia, but not Southeast Asia. So that was terrific exposure. So I ended up working in about, I think, 24 countries, but roughly half of the African countries, through ICRAF, and after 6 years of working on agroforestry, I then, interestingly, I sort of circled back to integrated rural development. I then joined the Earth Institute and spent 5 years with the Earth Institute with, it was called the Millennium Project. It included the Millennium Villages Project, but it was much more than that. It was working with countries to incorporate the Millennium Development Goals, the predecessor of the SDGs, right? So
Sustainable
I was
Development
with a number
Goals,
of countries, and we were trying to develop MDG-based strategies and development plans across Africa, mostly in East and Southern, but we worked across to West Africa as well.
So why did you make that step? Because if you start in Australia, where you were in touch a lot with the soil itself, you know, it was hands-on, and now you start going for Millennium Development Goals, which is at your level was a lot of discussion and meetings, I guess, right? So you were. Why did you make that change?
Yeah, there's a few reasons. Certainly, you get influenced by people who are around you, right? So I was very much that shift from working in agroforestry. Even agroforestry itself made me think more broadly than just the crops. You know, you were starting to think of these mosaics on landscapes and how all of this fitted into improving people's incomes and nutrition. It wasn't just about production. I must say, at Erie, so much of it was about how do we increase the production of rice? How do we get those yields up? And then in Africa, it was, you know, kind of way more nuanced. There was much more diversity of crops, and people had livestock, and people, you know, and there were just many other things going on. So that complexity was there. So it was sort of a logical step almost to think, well, okay, these people also go to school. They also they need access to clinics. Many of them don't have access to roads, transport, electrification. They don't have energy. So a lot of these things kind of were becoming more obvious. And then again, serendipity part 3 or 4, I met with Jeffrey Sachs, who then was the director of the Earth Institute. And he had been appointed by the then Secretary General, Kofi Annan, to, I think it was 2003 or so. It was 3 years into the Millennium Development Goals, 3 years past the Millennium Summit. And there was a realization that as good an idea this all was, nothing was happening. Like there wasn't much progress. No, countries weren't sort of picking it up. And so Kofi Annan asked Jeff Sachs to start the Millennium Project, particularly to sort of stimulate countries to start incorporating this into their national plans, getting donors on board, you know, fulfilling the promises that they had made previously. And this was very exciting to me. And Jeff met me, and we kind of, I think we connected well. And he said, well, look, why don't we set up, since you're in Nairobi already, why don't we set up a center there that would support countries to achieve the Millennium Development Goals? So I established something called the MDG Center, the Millennium Development Goals Center. And I built up a team of about 20 people from all over the world, but most of them from Africa. And we would support countries through a lot of, you know, I was still kind of the team specialist on agriculture. So that was still my kind of expertise. But I also had this sort of oversight of all of the different moving parts. We had health, we had education, we had governance, we had gender, we had environment, we had infrastructure. We had all these things were there. And so, as I said, it kind of took me back to Mindanao when I was working on a road project as the agriculturalist. But it made it again, I felt comfortable there because I could see the interconnectedness of all these investments, how important they all are, and how you get synergies and how there are sometimes trade-offs. And so I did that for 5 years, and it was, you know, extremely rewarding, mind-opening, and working with Jeffrey Sachs. You know, I got to meet. You know, I was in meetings with all of the presidents of all of these countries. I'd be sitting there with ministers of agriculture and ministers of health and, you know, water and all of this. And I really got a sense of how, you know, things at that level work. We, you know, interacted with all the donors, the UN agencies, the big, you know, NGO community that exists in across sub-Saharan Africa. So that was really, an exciting, very enjoyable time, not least because we're in Africa too, because I don't know, Maurice, if you've spent much time in Africa, but, you know, if there's one thing I would recommend people do at some point in their life is go and spend time in Africa. It is such an exciting, vibrant, interesting, engaging, challenging, but ultimately rewarding place to spend part of your life. And I had 11 years there, and I still go back on a pretty regular basis. I still try to keep work going there, and I send many of my students to across sub-Saharan Africa. I have a number of African students who come to Colombia, so I stay connected to the region, even though I'm, you know, physically based back in New York now.
Okay, before we go to New York in your time there, I would like to talk with you about the Millennium Development Goals, because they have been criticized. They ultimately, you know, changed into the Sustainable Development Goals. One of the criticisms is that, you know, those MDGs were developed by, Western academia sitting in their universities. So they try to do something about it when the SDGs were developed. So I would like to know, because you were very close to everything, right? And so if you look back, what do you think went well during that time when you were working on on the MDG Center that you were developed? And where do you think like, oh, we should have done this differently? And I know it's very complex, right? We could do 10 podcasts about this, but a quick assessment.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think you may gather from all of these conversations we're having that I'm kind of a glass half full man, not a half empty person. That I see a lot of positives that came from the MDG period. The fact that, particularly the leadership of Kofi Annan, the way he sort of stepped up and in particular focused attention on Africa, that was really important, and I think ultimately was a positive step for Africa and for Africans. There was certainly evidence of increased investments in areas like education and health, and improvements in both maternal and child health across Africa. That you could say, well, some of that might have happened anyway, but me being there traveling around, there was no doubt that the organizations, and including the national governments, were responding positively to these ideas of fundamental improvements in life, in the quality of life. And, as I said, education, health, I think, was sort of most important among them, but also agriculture and food production. At that time, pretty much, and this was one of the legacies I had from like coming from Asia, where I'd seen incredible progress. I'd seen the Green Revolution, but beyond the Green Revolution and the criticisms, the valid criticisms that exist there, the reality is it saved hundreds of millions of people from hunger and starvation. That lesson, some of the positive lessons from that, including my time in Cambodia, which was working with countries that, which was more like the kind of experience I would see in parts of Africa, countries that have been affected by conflict, countries that were principally rain-fed, not irrigated, countries that had like relatively limited human resource capacity. So I took a lot of that, not necessarily the models of action, but inspiration from that. And so agriculture, we worked with Kofi Annan in 2004, launched what we call the African Green Revolution. And Kofi Annan was very, very specific about this. He said this should be a uniquely African Green Revolution. So it is not kind of transporting what worked in the Philippines or even Cambodia to Africa. We needed to work with the specificities of Africa, which were very different. I mean, for a start, we didn't just have rice and wheat. We didn't have sort of two major commodities. There were many commodities. Livestock were important. 4% irrigation, whereas 50% irrigation in Asia. So you had very different circumstances, and you had much lower levels of infrastructure in terms of roads and energy, electricity, and you had generally lower investments in education and health, and major health issues like malaria, like HIV/AIDS. So taking into account all of these differences, we needed to work in a different manner. But I'm very positive about the impact. In fact, I've written about it extensively in my book, about the impact that this stimulus that Kofi Annan gave back in 2004, the impact that it's had on agricultural productivity across Africa. People haven't really yet realized what impact there has been. But if you, as I describe it in the book, if you take the first 15 years of the Asian Green Revolution, with all of the miracle rice varieties and all of that, then also compare it with the first 15 years of the African Green Revolution, they're very comparable. In fact, Africa slightly ahead of Asia. So it's something, really? But it's true. I've been looking at the numbers, and I lay it all out there. The point is this, is not to say, oh, well, the job's done, highly successful, let's go home. It's that the potential exists absolutely for sub-Saharan Africa and the countries therein to achieve food security. We know what's needed actually, and in many ways they know what is needed too. So it's a question of, putting together the right levels of investment, and moving forward. And I think you can have food security across virtually every nation of sub-Saharan Africa, barring those that are still, very much in conflict and struggling in terms of governance. But once you can get those parts together, if we can end conflict, improve governance, start to strengthen institutions, there's nothing you can't produce in across Africa. And you can certainly, I think in the long term, Africa could be providing food to the rest of the world. That's my assessment, my personal assessment from 11 years of living there.
Wow.
And many more years of coming back and forth to Africa.
And the book you are alluding to is called Universal Food Security: How to End Hunger While Protecting the Planet. So you will also put it in the podcast notes. I'd like to go to the next step with you, Glenn, and that is, I heard you loud and clear. The glass is half full. So the MDG did do a lot of good as well. Yes, you can critique it, but overall you can pinpoint at a lot of good things. Nevertheless, the world decides we need to go further, or do it differently, and they come up with the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 goals that were a result of more participation. I think even for the critics, were more people involved in ultimately. That's why we have probably 17 and not 5.
Yeah.
So the question that I always ask about the SDGs, Glenn, is what do you like the listeners to know about the SDGs?
Well, I think if you compare it with the MDGs, my sense was with the Millennium Development Goals, and I think Kofi Annan was very clear about that. It's really about ending extreme poverty. Okay, the focus was extreme poverty. The focus was, how do we mobilize resources in the world, namely in the rich countries, to bring those resources to bear on those countries that are really struggling, and those people that are really struggling. So it was very much, how do we reach out and help the poor, the extreme hungry, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
That was the theme. And naturally enough, Africa was very much in focus, right? Because that's where most of the poverty was. Asia as well, but a lot of it in terms of prevalence was Africa and food insecurity. The thing about the Sustainable Development Goals was a sort of a different reflection, looking at the broader global development challenges that exist, the diversity of challenges that exist, that not only are in the poorest countries, but are in the richest countries, including the one where we live, where you get huge inequalities. You have challenges of sustainability. And, of course, at the time of the MDGs, yes, we knew about climate change, but it wasn't at the top of the agenda when it came to dealing with extreme poverty. So I think incorporating, having understanding sustainable development as not just being lifting people out of poverty, but the idea that was embodied in the SDGs and agenda, the 2030 agenda, was that there are these three pillars. There's economic, there's social, and there's environmental. So you have these three components that need to be in place. So yes, indeed, economic, people need to be lifted out of poverty. People's incomes need to increase so they can live a decent life and send their kids to school and buy medicines when they need it, and so on, and live in a decent house. But the idea of the social aspects, that people, we've left many people behind. So the idea of nobody should be left behind was an important theme. So it's not about halving hunger. It's not about halving poverty. It's about really ending these things. So I think there was sort of a different mindset about inclusion. So it means we have to go out of our way to see who's left behind. Are they women? Are they children? Are they indigenous people? Are they particular race or demographic groups? Are they disabled people? Are they youth? All of these, we had to think more sort of in a much more nuanced way about who is being left behind. And that is, to me, the core of the social side. And then the environmental side is, look, with all of what we're doing in the world, and particularly, actually it works at both ends, rich countries and poor countries, we have environmental degradation. So we have biodiversity loss, we have soil degradation, we have over exploitation of water resources, we have, of course, climate change. And so we need to establish a more prosperous, inclusive, and environmentally sustainable world. So that is a much broader concept than simply ending poverty. Ending poverty has to be part of that. Is actually that we shouldn't take our eyes off the ball and say, well, we won't deal with poverty anymore, we'll focus on climate. Or no, poverty is still absolutely there front and center. It's SDG 1, right? And it's SDG 1 for a good reason. So I think they're the main differences. One other difference I would say for you to understand is MDGs were very public sector focused. It was much more about efforts of governments and UN agencies and even NGOs to be involved. But now I think the idea is you really require whole of society. We need to engage not just governments, not just the public sector, but the private sector. Businesses need to be engaged. Many of the problems of development can be addressed more effectively through the role of private sector, social enterprises, and other ways in which we can connect and complement public and private. And the third sector, of course, the kinds of organizations like yours and others, and philanthropies and others need to be involved as well. And then finally, individuals. Every person on the planet can do something about sustainable development. So they're the main differences, I would say, as we shifted to the SDGs.
No, I really appreciate that, and you lifting up the fact that the SDGs are trying to really look at sustainability, where you have three pillars: the economic, social, as well as the environmental. And I really think that's very clear, and everything is interrelated, and it concerns all of us. The question that I have for you is, though, if you look at the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, on average, we are still far from the goals. We are at 15% at average. And there is this growing group of people that have been saying, one of the reasons that we are not making the progress that we need to make is that we are requiring systems and process changes around these SDGs, but we haven't paid proper attention to the ability, skills, and knowledge that we need as individuals and as communities to make those changes work. You mentioned yourself, we all need to be our part, but if you never work on your empathy skills, on or critical thinking, how are we getting there? So this group did a survey and they came up ultimately with 5 goals, 5 inner development goals: being, thinking, relating, collaborating, and acting. And they identified 23 skills like empathy, critical thinking. They should add one more, because I think forgiveness is not there, and maybe we could use that one nowadays very much.
Tolerance.
Tolerance. Yeah. So yeah, what do you think if you hear about that, these IDGs? Not as the solution, but being in balance with the other stuff that we need to do. The fact that every issue has at least 4 perspectives. It's I and we. So even if you work on it and its, you need to realize that there is an I involved as well, and a we.
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly it's more than just knowledge, right? Like just having the knowledge of what to do. I think most of us, in most of the areas that we work in, be it agriculture, health, education, energy, and so on, most of us feel that, look, there is a lot of knowledge out there that, if applied, would actually lead to a better world. But sorry to come back to it again, but as I wrote in the book, in some ways, the easy bit was to work out what needed to be done in terms of what, where you need your agriculture, you need your markets, you need your post-harvest technologies, changing diets, all these, we know, we've learned, we really have learned what is needed. But how do you bring this into practice? And I think the kind of emphasis that in a development goals, not that I was familiar with it, but certainly the things that are described there resonate very well with me. That's really at the heart of what we try to introduce through this Masters in Development Practice that I teach at Columbia. Because I do agree, so much of what needs to be done, for me, it comes down to leadership. It comes down to personal leadership. And I mean a very special kind of leadership, not sort of take charge and send people in this direction and that direction. But as you said, having not just the knowledge, but the skills, okay? So the skills, a set of values that drive you, and those values include even the values right behind you there now: walk, talk, and listen. The idea that, walk the talk, but also listen, and the importance of collaboration, partnerships, something I always call it blended solutions that require special skill sets, because development is complex. It's complex and it's nuanced. The solution for New York City is very different from the solution in Malawi or Timor-Leste. And it's a set of solutions, and it's best understood through the lens of what I described much earlier. And that was what I learned in that institutional design course, the idea that institutions should be reflecting the needs and aspirations of the people that they're meant to serve, right? Not the people who are running those institutions. So I'm very supportive of all that, and my goal is to build a community through my, certainly, hopefully supported by the network of students that I have had in my program over the last 15 years. I have 650 students, graduates of the program, currently working in about 80 countries around the world. And so, I mean, that to me is a very, that gives me a lot of hope, because I think they subscribe, even though they don't call them inner development goals, I think they subscribe to the kinds of things that the inner development goals are espousing. And again, I'm sorry for the the sunlight kind of
No,
boring through
I think that was a
Is there some
sign.
symbolism there?
Yes, it's a symbolism in it. For the listeners who cannot see this, but the
Yeah.
sun is
Okay.
really,
Yeah.
making this halo.
And I'm
so
fading
this is-
into the background, which is absolutely appropriate and metaphorically correct at this point.
Wonderful. If you were asked to walk 100 miles in a week to raise, money for the cause, so for which cause would you do that?
What a great question. I think I'd focus on something that I'm most familiar with, and that would be nutrition. And it would be, I like to focus on issues that have, my first priority is life and death, right? So saving lives is number one. So the idea of getting life-saving medicine, nutrition to mothers and children, particularly who are in need in places like Gaza and wherever else, like in the world, where people are desperately in need of this to simply stay alive, is where I would put my first half of the money. The second half probably would be into causes that are addressing problems that are irreversible. And for that, again, I'll stick with nutrition and look at stunting, the effects of stunting on children, the chronic malnutrition that leads to cognitive challenges and educational and even livelihood impacts later in life. So addressing those now, because every time we miss it, a child in the womb or a 2-year-old, when we miss that, we've missed them for life. We've lost them, right? At least not lost them permanently, but we've lost opportunities. So that's where I sort of, in the sort of malnutrition, because at the end of the day, we're all about, we want people to fulfill their potential. And a malnourished child, and it starts with a malnourished mother, cannot fulfill their potential. So I'd probably put my funds raised from the 100 miles into that.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. What I hope with this podcast is that I help to connect people. So I connect you with my listeners. I also try to connect you with other guests. So, and I came up through a question. So I have a question for you from the previous guest.
In the future, this could be 30 years after you're gone, whenever. What kind of world do you hope to see for our children?
For our children and grandchildren, yes. I think the elements are simply, the first priority would be a peaceful world. I think I find it shocking that we come back to many of the same old places that are challenged by conflict. Somalia is a good example. We seem to come back to these things every few years, these places. So I think sustainable peace, ending conflict, the absolute waste of resources, not to mention lives, of course, lives, but of futures and resources through the wars that we're carrying on in the world today, whether it's Ukraine and Gaza and wherever else. There's just so much waste at a time when we're challenged, when there are other things that we could be doing with those resources. So again, not to mention just the lives lost. That to me, that would be a better world. A peaceful world would be a great start, because Even when I was working in Africa, it was like, it's difficult to improve food security when there's bullets flying around and when bombs going off, right? So a peaceful world is really important. I think in line with that, I'd like to see a world that was more equitable, one where we could see a better distribution of wealth, because we all know that all the statistics are out there about the incredible concentration of wealth in both rich countries and poor countries. And so finding ways that that wealth could be more effectively distributed would really be extremely valuable. So they would be two things. And of course, because of my personal passion and interests, a food secure world is really, that's the goal. That's my goal. That's my career goal. That's the arguments contained in my book, that I believe that we can achieve a food secure world, a world without hunger and malnutrition, and a world that is where this food is produced in a way that's sustainable and is not undermining the potential of future generations to produce their food. So bring these things together. Very idealistic, but that's what I want. End the conflict. Okay. Improve equity and reduce inequality, and ensure that everybody has access to adequate, healthy, safe food, to fulfill their potential. So ultimately what we want, right, if we try to understand what is sustainable development, we're wanting a world where people can fulfill their individual potential. And you can't do that when you're hungry. You can't do that when you're poor. You can't do that, when bullets are flying around, right? So that would be my positive future. Yeah.
Your question for the next guest.
I'm not good at this, but my question for the next guest is this. If you could have an 18th SDG, what would it be and why?
Nice. I like that question.
That requires that your next guest knows what the 17 are.
Yeah, we'll
that's the
ensure
point.
That. Okay, we are accelerating now
Yes.
the question and answers. If I ask you to mention a song that embodies, for a big part, or a piece of music, what you are about, which song or piece of music would that be, and why?
But do you know Fela Kuti?
Yes.
The Nigerian
Yes.
musician and activist. He was very popular in the 70s. There was a Broadway show when I first got to New York. I went and saw Fela Kuti 3-4 times. The Broadway show about his music. There's a wonderful song called "Water No Get Enemy." Water No Get Enemy. Any of your African listeners will be very familiar with that incredible 10-minute song from one of his albums in the 70s, early 70s, 75, I think it was. It was, in fact, metaphorical. It was also about his activist role, and that the sort of changes that he was wanting to see in Nigeria shouldn't really, is so obvious. It's like water, it wouldn't have any enemies, right? But I think there's the sort of more direct issue, particularly in Africa, but all over the world, that water should have no enemy. We welcome water. We need water. We can't live without water. We can't live a healthy life without water. We can't grow food and all of these things. So who would be against it, right? Water no get enemy. So living in harmony with nature, I think, was also one of the themes that he was espousing in that. But like everything else, it's never simple, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you happen to have been living in Pakistan over the last few years, and experienced the floods there, or in parts of China,
Mm-hmm.
you would say, yeah, water is our enemy too.
Mm-hmm.
It's there's always the opposite is also true, always in these cases. Understanding complexity,
Mm-hmm.
that something like water brings great benefits to many, but also, we need to find ways to harness that so that we can, ultimately improve the quality of life. I've always said, and if you read the chapter in my book, there's plenty of water in the world. We just need to use it more effectively than we currently do, right? And that doesn't mean there are problems in specific locations, but there is enough water to go around on this planet. But we're not using it very well. So Fela Kuti, highly recommend.
Right.
And all of that is a great song. It's a great song, and really throws us back to that wonderful spirit driving Africa. So
any last message for the listeners?
Yeah, I mean, let me just say this, that and I often, this is what I share, particularly with the younger listeners, the early career people who are, like embarking on this incredibly challenging but often very rewarding sort of life of service to sustainable development and to food security. I have a few sort of key points. One would be bold and ambitious. We're not at a time where we can be incremental. So take big steps and move forward. Secondly, become better informed. And one thing I would ask people to avoid is what I would call food fundamentalism or development fundamentalism. Look for blended solutions. It's not one or the other. It's combinations, right? Don't go down that trap of what I call false dichotomies of one model versus another model. Keep focused on who we're trying to serve here and listen. Third would be collaborative. And collaborative means creating often unlikely alliances. There are many young folks who say, oh, I would never work with the private sector. I don't want to work with big business. I don't want to work even with the UN. I don't want to work with governments. No, we've got to actually work with all of them. Even if you find your place more comfortably in one of them, you're going to have to work with the others. And you should work with the others if you want to have an impact on the world. All right. So be collaborative, be open to these unlikely alliances. And I would just say, finally, above all, do something. Do something. All right. So the something might be make better choices in your everyday life in terms of consumption, what you purchase, what you consume, what you eat, and so on. Support political causes that are aligned to the kinds of goals that we've been talking about today, the Sustainable Development Goals plus. Volunteer, walk 100 miles if that's what it takes. Step out there and do something. But last but not least, really consider a career in this area, and particularly the area that I'm excited about, food security. Improving, nutrition, improving livelihoods of farmers, and so on. It is such an interesting world, and it's such an interesting ecosystem that you can find a niche for yourself in whether it's the UN, whether it's government, whether it's the NGO, third sector, whether it's business, whether it's your own personal entrepreneurship, applying that to solve this problem, because we need everyone. We need that full ecosystem working, in harmony to deliver a food secure world. So by all means, get hold of my book. It's probably too expensive for a lot of people. So get your library to buy it for the school or whatever it is. If you happen, I don't know how many, Maurice, of your listeners are in India, but the book was just released by Penguin Random House India, and it costs about 600 rupees or something, less than $10. So it's actually quite affordable there. But honestly, if anybody, really wants it and can't afford it, write me an email and tell me about it, and I'll find a way to get you the book. All right, because I want you to read it. Yeah.
And
okay.
Thank you so much, Glenn. I mean, it was
sure. You're welcome.
And all the best. And yes, buy the book. I concur. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Walk, Talk, Listen. Please check us out on 100mile.org or follow us on Facebook or Instagram.